When we were doing the credits for the film, we decided not to use the credit director, and we debated over what to use, and we decided the best thing to do was that I would be the producer, and Lucien Chastain-Taylor, who shot the film, who was sort of in the position of being a director, called himself recordist. And the idea behind this is that we felt that director was a term that's used with fiction films, and it's the kind of term that implies that you have somebody telling everybody what to do. So we didn't feel comfortable with that term. We wanted the notion of whoever was there recording the action was more of a recordist than a director. And then we did go ahead and use the terms edited by and sound by, because in fact, I don't think you can pretend that films aren't made by people. There are choices that filmmakers make all the time, and even by recording something, we're making choices, but we're not directing anybody to do anything. When we first started making the film, I think we thought we were going to focus more on the owner of the ranch, who's the man who is helping the first ewe give birth. He's also standing next to his son when the son tells the cowboy joke. He's the one driving the ATV, the vehicle through town with all the sheep following him. And he was quite shy, even though he wanted the film to be made about him. He wouldn't always sort of be around when we were trying to film. So we didn't film him as much as we filmed the other people, who are the sheep herder and the camp tender named Pat and John. And they were the ones who were up in the mountains for a couple of months with the sheep, alone with my husband, who was shooting the film, so that we had a lot more dialogue and a lot more action in the film that came from Pat and John and what they were doing. And as we started editing, we singled out all of the conversations between Pat and John. Some of the conversations we left in the film, some of them we took out. And as we went along with all the editing, we realized that there were two very distinct characters emerging. We had Pat as sort of the younger cowboy who's kind of learning what to do and finds the job more frustrating. And we have John, who's more relaxed, he's older, and he's sort of the wise old cowboy who knows how to do things. And it was interesting because I don't think people are not as black and white as that. I think that Pat knew a lot more than perhaps he emerged as, and was a lot calmer than he appeared on the film. And I think that John, in fact, was a little bit more frantic than he appeared on the film. And it's just kind of what happens sometimes when you make a film, is that characters emerge that are somewhat who they are, but it's not always completely as true as it might have been. So there's some truth, and then there's some aspects that are not entirely true about them. I think the film is many things. I think it's a documentary, it's an ethnographic film. It also is, I do think it's a Western. I think it's a new kind of Western, and I do feel that it tells a story. I think the story is somewhat simple. It's a year in the life of a ranch. There's a central narrative, which is that they take the sheep up into the mountains, they stay in the mountains, they encounter enemies, bears, and they fight these bears and they lose a little. They then go down the mountain with the sheep. And I think that's a very simple story. I do think perhaps there are some plot twists in there. You don't really know how frustrating it's going to be. You think if it's a Western, everything will be okay. But in fact, at the end, you find out that this way of life is not going to continue. You know, even though they were successful in bringing down most of the sheep alive, even though they're going to sell the sheep and make some money, their lifestyle is not going to be lasting too much longer because it is too hard. And that's where the documentary part comes in. The tagline for the film is "The Last Ride of the American Cowboy." And we like that idea because it does imply that this is a lifestyle that once was very strong and now doesn't exist anymore. But in fact, technically, it's the last sheep drive in that area. And people who herd sheep are not technically cowboys, but they look like cowboys. They have cowboy hats and they ride horses. We did know, what?
They speak like that.
And they speak like cowboys. We did know it would be the last sheep drive. We thought that we had heard that these were the last people in this area taking the sheep up into the mountains with this kind of enormous effort, and we wanted to film that. What we didn't know is that the year we went was not the last sheep drive, so we went back the next year, and that was not the last sheep drive, and then we went back a third year, and finally, that was the last sheep drive, which we felt was important to document. I think we study documentary and have seen lots of documentaries, historical documentaries, contemporary documentaries, and I think all of that sort of gets folded into our work. Certainly Robert Flaherty was an influence. I think you can see similarities between this film and Nanook of the North. You have the heroes who fight nature, and nature in this film is represented not only by bears, but also by sheep and also landscape. So you have these two heroes have to overcome all of the obstacles presented by landscape, sheep, and wolves and bears, and then they emerge somewhat triumphant, but not entirely so. Other traditions, there's a film called Grass that was made in 1925 by Miriam Cooper and Ernest Schoedstack, who went on to make the film King Kong some years later. And that film is about Bakhtiari nomads who are herding in Iraq, and they're herding an enormous amount of sheep over rivers and mountains, and against various obstacles. And that film was called Grass. So this film, definitely Sweetgrass, refers to that film. And then there are films by David and Judith McDougall, which are more contemporary films they made in Africa that incorporate this idea of the long take, not editing quickly. And also there's the work of Robert Gardner, who really looks at beautiful elements within various cultures and sort of examines sort of the environment in which people live and seeks out the sort of symbolic elements of that environment and sees the ways in which that environment affects characters. We actually got thrown into the film in March of 2001 and started shooting in June. So we didn't have a lot of lead time to prepare. We were living in the American West, we were living in Colorado, so we were beginning to sort of look around and think about how interesting the American West is and how there are all these sort of contradictory kinds of lifestyles within the West. You have very liberal people, you have very conservative people, all sort of working with the same landscape. And we thought, well, those will be interesting ideas to explore. How do we do that? And then we found this community of sheep herders, and we sort of plunged right into the filmmaking. We read some books. There is some literature about sheep herding from that area. There's a novelist called Ivan Doig who writes about Scottish sheep herders, a little further to the north from the Sweetgrass sheep herders. So, but we hadn't done a lot of research. We kind of learned along the way, which is kind of an anthropological methodology, is you learn a little bit through books, but then you learn most of what you're doing by actually being there and doing what we call participant observation. You live with the people and you see how they lived and you see how they talk about how they live. And our research is really done in that way, sort of in the field, as they say.